Good morning or afternoon. Good day. Good day. How's everyone doing? So I'm going to share with you what is relatively very briefly about a woman by the name of Margaret Murray Washington. And I'll start by how I was introduced to Margaret Washington. And so I first learned about Margaret when I was in graduate school. And my professor at the time at Florida A&M University, he was doing a number of studies on Booker T. Washington's Bookerites. And he was working on Charles Banks in particular, but there was very little work that was done on women administrators at historically black colleges, but there was also little done on women who were wives of the administrators at these HBCUs. And so he gave me a number of works to read, and one in particular was looking at Out of the Shadow of Tuskegee. And all I kept seeing was Mrs. Booker T. Washington, Mrs. Booker T. Washington. And at some point she was called Fanny, and other points she was called Olivia. And so I think at the beginning that sort of piqued my curiosity in, does his wife have 5 names? Or are there multiple wives? And so that's what really brought me into finding out who Margaret was as the wife of Booker T. Washington, but also who she was alone. One of the other things that was sparked in discovering her or researching her were these ideas of gender and race. And oftentimes it's common to attempt to separate gender and race. And while studying her, I was finding more and more on how it's not mutually exclusive, and that in order to look at her in its completeness, you have to look at gender and race together. There was also this question of power and fulfillment. And automatically, there's this notion that because she was born enslaved and because her parents or her mother was born enslaved and at least one of her siblings were born enslaved and she was born with the gender of female, that this idea or notion of power may or may not really exist. And it wasn't going to exist in the traditional models that I would look at it. And so I had to think about this notion of power a little different. And so it forced me to look at how are these women who are born during this time period executing power and agency, and what is it that they have at their disposal that they're using to sort of lead the race out of those particular areas. And at the end, it was this relationship between personal and history. And so I think that's one that truly has guided me since graduate school onto today, is that in the same ways that it's almost impossible to separate race and gender, it's also sort of impossible to separate this relationship between personal and history. And so we'll talk about that through this very brief discussion today, and so I hope you enjoy it. This is a quote by Margaret Washington, and she says, "There is no question which affects any part of the South in which I am not interested and for which I am not willing to give both time and strength." And if you know anything about Margaret Washington or Booker T. Washington, you know that they were deeply, deeply engaged in the South and uplifting the South, but they were national and also international reformers. But Margaret Washington is always going to remain deeply ingrained in the South, although towards the end of her life, she's going to start the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, where many of her reforms are then going to be taken internationally as well. And more particularly in Haiti, we see a lot of movement. And so while we're looking at a very small portion of her reform work within Alabama and then in Tuskegee, these are also parts of very larger movements as well. And so 1972. So in 1972, Margaret Washington is going to be the first woman of African descent to be inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. And at this particular time, the question comes up, well, what took so long for someone of African descent to be inducted into the Hall of Fame? And so what you see here is the front page for the Hall of Fame ceremony that they had. And so I'm going to just go to the next slide to just show you how she came about being here. Does anyone know who these two people are? kind of blurry. Arthur Gaston is at the top, and was a millionaire in Birmingham. And next to him is his wife, and her name is Minnie Gaston, and she's also a millionaire.
He was known as A.G. Gaston, wasn't he?
Yes, exactly. A.G. Gaston, a millionaire at this particular time period. But she's also a graduate of Tuskegee Institute. And so she's going to send the petition for Margaret to be a part of, or to be inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 1972. And one of the things that she's going to write about Margaret during this time is that Mrs. Washington was 100 years ahead of her time. What a pity Alabama and the nation did not see the value of her work 75 years ago. And so this is sort of brings us to where we are today. And that was Minnie Gaston in 1972, writing back to the president at that time, who was Luther Foster. And so she's basically telling him, because she's on the board of directors of the Alabama Women's Federation, that her petition for Margaret to be inducted had been accepted. And so this is what she's saying of Margaret during this particular time period. So the big question becomes, who was Margaret Murray Washington? And at first glance, she is the wife of Booker T. Washington. But what we also see is that she is much, much, much more than just the wife of Booker T. Washington. And one thing that we know, because we know that she lived a very full life, is that she was born. And so why do I say it like that? There has been a lot of controversy over when she was actually born. I'm just playing with this thing on my ear. On when Margaret was actually born. And so a number of things can be used to describe this. So one could be memory. This idea of not actually having a date because she's born in slavery. Another thing can be to appear to be younger. And so some of the years that are used are 1861, 1864, 1865. And so the year that I use is 1861 because this is the one that I can find more in terms of census records. But there are a number of different years that are used for her actual birth. And so we know that she's born in Macon, Mississippi. She's born to an enslaved mother, and her mother's name is Lucy Murray. In terms of occupation, her mother is a washerwoman at that particular time period, so she was in domestic or inside of the household during the period of servitude. And her father was an Irish railroad worker during this time. And so by the date, we know that Margaret is going to be born during the period of servitude, and she's going to live at least 3 to 4 years enslaved. And so this is also going to paint or be a very important component of her later initiatives around not only gender, but also class. Another thing that we see her being really, really stark about is this idea not just of citizenship rights, but first-class citizenship rights. And so we see this, and a lot of it is going to trace back to her mother and trace back to many of her mother's teachings. And so with Margaret Washington's mother being a washerwoman, this in many ways, when we talk or we go back to this idea of power, this in many ways is going to give her mother some forms of autonomy, some forms of power in which she can use, one, so that her children can constantly be around her in many ways. And even after the period of servitude, you find that many women have to take occupations where they have to leave their children. And so this was one occupation in which she was able to be more so with her children for longer periods of time. The other interesting thing about Margaret's mother is that she could read. And she could read, but she could not write. And so with that, she really, really pushed these ideas or notions of education. And the interesting thing is that she's pushing these ideas of education very, very hard on her daughters. And so one thing that we know in terms of Margaret Washington's early life is that she's going to have a number of siblings. The actual number of siblings is something where we get different numbers. So we know that she has an older sister at the time of her birth. So when she's born, there's at least 2 of them. Throughout her life, she also gives different numbers as to how many siblings she actually has. The largest number that is documented is 10. There are other numbers that say as few as 5. These numbers are also for various reasons. Some of it could be that there were an extension of what would be known as this nuclear family structure, where her mother brought in children, perhaps who did not have mothers or fathers during that time period. The other thing that we know is that Margaret's mother and Margaret are going to suffer from very poor health. And so this is going to impact Margaret's life, but it's also going to impact the type of initiatives that she's going to start in Tuskegee. Margaret also is not going to have any children. And so a number of these things that are coming out of her youth, we see them throughout her entire life, and we also see them in terms of what she really focuses on through her mother's meetings and through the Tuskegee Women's Club as well. And when she's a part of these national and international organizations, she keeps at the forefront ideas of health and ideas of power. And so much of that can be traced back to her mother. The last thing that I'll say in terms of this, and I'll mention it again throughout the discussion, is this idea of education. And so one thing that we see in terms of her push for education, and I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead, is that when Margaret goes to Tuskegee, if you didn't know, she's going to go to Tuskegee. When Margaret goes to Tuskegee, one of the things that she's really, really going to be instrumental on is recreating the curriculum. And as she's recreating the curriculum, she's going to come across obvious challenges, because creating these curriculums around domestication and creating these curriculums around what women are doing in the house and making it scientific is going to be challenged, not just by those outside of Tuskegee, but she's also going to find a number of challenges inside Tuskegee as well, because she's placing scientific models in these studies of domesticity. And so with that, she's also going to add this study of Black history. And so that's one thing that we see her mother was also really, really a strong proponent of, is not just education, but education in terms of education of self, but also education as a form or token of power that she would be able to have, not only because she was born Black, but also because she's born female. And so this was something that her mother is going to give to her at a very early age. And so why am I stressing or emphasizing what her mother is giving her early? Is that Margaret is going to ultimately be adopted, and this adoption is going to be an informal adoption by Quakers. And so Quakers are also going to have an influence on her education, on her later philosophies about gender, on her later philosophies about reform work. But it's also very important to note that her mother also is playing a very important role in how she thinks about herself within this larger society. So some things that we know. We know that she's adopted. We know that her father's name is James Murray. We know that she's born 1861. We also know that she has at least one sister at the time of her birth. We know that she's going to be adopted roughly around the age of 7. And so some sources indicate that her father is killed when she is 7. And so because of very high poverty rates, because of education, because of the way that the South is situated, she's going to be informally adopted at the age of 7. She's going to remain in Macon, Mississippi from 7 until 14. So during that time period, she's going to have she's going to be in very close proximity to her other siblings and to her mother at that particular time period. after her father dies, her mother is going to marry. And so that's going to come later. And then there are other children that are had during that particular union. But Margaret is going to be adopted. And the Quakers who are going to adopt her are a brother and sister pair. And they're known as the Saunders during this particular time period. And one thing that the Saunders are going to do for her is that when she turns 14, they are going to help her to move to Nashville, Tennessee. And do we know what HBCU is in Nashville, Tennessee? Fisk, exactly. And so while Margaret is in Nashville, Tennessee, the first thing that she does is that she's going to get her certificate in order to be able to teach. And so she's going to go into many of these private schools that are coming up in Nashville to teach. And so she's teaching at 14, and she's going to do this form of education and reform work until she's 21. When Margaret turns 21, she's then going to enroll at Fisk University. When she enrolls at Fisk University, one of the things that she says is that she always heard, or whenever the Jubilee Singers were singing, she would always go to where they were. And so the Fisk Jubilee Singers were a local influence, but we also know, if we know a little history about Fisk, is that they were really instrumental in keeping the school afloat, especially when they were dealing with some of the financial issues in its beginning years. And so while Margaret Washington is at Fisk, she's also going to have an opportunity to meet Du Bois, and they are going to work on the school newspaper together. And so in isolation, it's, oh, okay, cool. She wrote a few articles in the newspaper. But looking at it from a distance, we also see that now she has these opportunities where she's doing these things with various genders. So men and women collaborating together. On the Fisk newspaper, they were not just journalists, but they also engaged in reform work. And so during this particular time, Margaret Washington, or Margaret Murray, who she is still at this time, and other editors on the board are going to do things like go into remote areas and help to build schools. And so as they're doing this reform work of building schools, they're then going to come back and write about it. And so that's sort of how this editorial work worked during this particular time period. And so why is that important? It's important because when she moves to Tuskegee, we see that she hits the ground running. But what we ultimately know is that this running is starting very, very early in her life. And it's continuously being cultivated as she moves into these different positions. And so she's going to remain at Fisk University for a total of 8 years. And she's going to be there for 8 years because at this time period, she's going to be what they call a half-rater. And if we're familiar with that today, that would be a part-time student. And so as this part-time student, she's going to work in the home of Fisk faculty. She's going to be engaged in the community. And these are all ways of helping her to pay for her education. And so she's graduating from Fisk in 1889. And when she graduates from Fisk in 1889, she's going to be one of 2 females that graduate. And if I can get the pin, she's here, Margaret James Murray. They say she's 25, right? 135 pounds, 5'7", but we know she's far shorter than 5'7". She's more like 5'4" or 5'3". Did it go out? It's cool. So I want to bring you to the part where it says matrimonial prospects, and you see that it says good, right? So, and if you compare it to other ones that have 0, and then there's one that has 100%, so we could probably assume that perhaps they were already married. But what we know during this time is that Margaret Washington is going to be courting someone. And as she's courting this person, prior to her graduation ceremony, she has plans to go to Texas to teach. So how does she get to Tuskegee? Prior to her graduation, she actually sends a letter to Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington, prior to Margaret moving to Tuskegee, is widowed twice. Almost, right? At the time of her letter, at the time that she's writing the letter, he is not yet widowed twice, he's widowed once. But his wife is ill. And so she writes him a letter because her graduation is coming up, and she basically says, I heard about your wife's illness and I send my condolences, and I also want to inquire about a position at Tuskegee Institute. Does Washington respond? He does not respond to her. And so what happens? So at her graduation, Booker T. Washington is not the keynote speaker, and he happens to sit at her table. So I don't know if that's divine fate or not, but they sit at the same table together, and he gives this happy, what they say, speech afterwards, but he's not the keynote speaker. And during this time, Margaret uses this opportunity to sort of pull him to the side. Hey, Booker, I know you saw this letter that I wrote you. And at that particular time, his wife had passed away. And so now he's widowed twice. And she basically says, yes, I did accept a position, but I really would like to go to Tuskegee. And Booker says, okay. And he gives her a position as an English teacher at her graduation. And so while prior to the graduation, she had plans to move elsewhere with this good suitor, she ends up going to Tuskegee Institute instead. And so I like this picture because oftentimes when we see Booker T. Washington, we usually see him working. Now, he still has on a suit, but he is in more of a casual position. And I think this also shows how Margaret probably saw him as well. And one thing I'll also mention about Margaret, since I started with this notion of names, is that personally she goes by the name Mimi, Maggie. She goes by the name Maggie, but in personal settings, she goes by the name Booker T. Washington, or Mrs. Booker T. Washington. And when I was talking earlier about this idea of personal and history, when I first heard that she was going by Mrs. Booker T. Washington, my first reaction was, well, why isn't she using her name? Well, how come she's using Booker T. Washington's name? And it really showed my lack of knowledge on the particular time period, because using Booker T. Washington's name was entry. It was protection. It allowed her access into spaces that her name, not because it wasn't a fine name, but because of the politics of that particular time period, would not have allowed her to do and say and be on the platforms in which she was on. And so publicly, and especially after Booker T. Washington's 1915 death, she's going to go exclusively as Mrs. Booker T. Washington. Even on the census records, everything, she's Mrs. Booker T. Prior to his death, she goes back and forth, Margaret Murray Washington or Mrs. Booker T. Washington. But privately, she's known as Maggie. And so you get very few pictures as well of Maggie being Maggie. And usually the pictures that you see are going to be the public persona of Mrs. Booker T. Washington. And so I just wanted to show that. So they are married. And this is going to be Booker T. Washington's third and final marriage. And it's going to be Margaret Washington's only marriage. And so Margaret Washington is going to come to Tuskegee Institute in 1889, the same year that she graduates. I don't know if she just rode with him to the Institute at that particular time period, but I know she left shortly after her graduation. When she gets to Tuskegee Institute, she's originally going to be an English instructor, which she's generally going to always attempt to stay in the classroom, but she's also going to, a year later, assume a different role. And that role is going to be Lady Principal. And Lady Principal at that time basically is that she oversaw all of the administrative duties of the girls' division within Tuskegee Institute at that particular time period. And so that's going to happen a year after she moves there, and then they're going to get married shortly thereafter in 1892. This is a picture of the Washington family. And so just briefly, we know that Booker T. Washington was married twice before he marries Margaret Murray Washington. And in those marriages, he's going to have a total of 3 children. His oldest is going to be Portia, and then he's going to have Booker Jr. and Ernest. And so she's going to ultimately become an instant wife, but also an instant mother as well. And she doesn't have any children of her own with Washington, or even after Washington's death. There are a number of ideas that surround it. And Margaret even will say herself, there have been a number of letters where she's writing to Booker in the beginning years of their marriage, where she basically says, listen, I am not really that good with little folk. I'm going to need your guidance or your attention on this matter. And Washington pretty much gives her the, listen, you got this. I'm here trying to solve this larger race issue. Get along with Portia, right? So her and Portia. And very little credit is given to Portia. And I know my time is coming, but I'll just give just a brief overview of that. And so here Portia is, and she's the oldest daughter, and she's the oldest daughter, and she has to, throughout her entire life, share her father with the race and with the world. And with that, she also loses her mother, her first mother, at a very early age. And then Booker T. Washington marries again, and she loses that mother at a very early age. And her father is pulled away even more. After 1895, Booker T. Washington is going to be off campus for 6 to 7 months per year. And so as a little girl growing up, this detachment is very much so real. And then Margaret is going to come into the picture, and here it is, the third woman that's coming, and my father is not here as much, and Margaret is very matter of fact, stern, so they do have an interesting relationship in the beginning years. And so it's sort of to be expected with all of the things that Portia has to go through before Margaret gets to that place. And also this idea of she wants her father, because her father is that one constant. Her father is the one who's been there while everyone else leaves, and the one thing that is truly her own. And so you sort of see that. And then you ultimately see Margaret coming around to liking children a little bit more. And she's going to informally adopt her niece and her nephew once the children are officially out of the household. So everyone comes around eventually. All right, so who is Margaret, or the evolution of Margaret Murray Washington? And so we sort of have talked about this evolution of Margaret Murray Washington as an educator. Education is going to be deeply instilled in her. Education is going to be something that really is the mainstay of her professional and personal life. And we see that evolution, and it's interesting that I'm having this talk in February, because one of the things that Margaret Washington in terms of education is really big on outside of curriculum, it's Black history. And so she has numerous letters that she's writing to Carter G. Woodson to get him to come and teach at Tuskegee Institute at this time period. And their schedules just never mesh. And so what he does ultimately is he's going to send her a number of pamphlets to use. And so she's going to incorporate those into the classroom, but she's also going to use those with her national club organizations as well. Margaret is going to be very influential in the Black Women's Club movement. And so while in the chapter I talk more so about her work with the Tuskegee Women's Club, this is only going to be but one of her larger movements that she's a part of. And so just to name a few of them, she's going to start what becomes known as the Mothers Meeting. Mother's Meeting is just a little different from the Tuskegee Women's Club, because Mother Meetings is going to be working class women as well. Then she's going to start the Tuskegee Women's Club. Tuskegee Women's Club is going to be more of an elite or middle class sort of sorority club because it's private. And so she had to actually extend an invitation for you to join the club, especially in the beginning years. Then she's going to be the president of the National Federation of African American Women, which is contested as one of the first national organizations of women. Then she's going to eventually be the president of the National Association of Colored Women. And she's going to start the International Council of Women of the Darker Races. Under the NACW, which is the National Association of Colored Women, she's also going to start the Southern Federation of Women and also the Alabama Colored Federation. And so she has a lot of hats. Uplifting as we climb, and this is going to be one of the mottos of the National Association of Colored Women, but it is also really one of the mainstays of Margaret Washington. You're going to see, or you see within a lot of her documentary and a lot of her writings, where she sort of chastises the women within these more elite groups of saying, you can't be who you are if you don't go back and help someone else to get there. You can't just think of your uplift as yourself or as your children if there are children who live on a different block who aren't able to engage in those same types of freedoms. And so she really embodied that. She also embodied respectability politics. And one of the interesting ways that she's embodying respectability politics is that she understands politics for Black women is as much about the ballot as it is about performance. And so she talks about this performance often on how someone has to act. And now, whether she believed that those actions were real, it didn't matter. What she knew was that they were effective. And so she really, really pushed for the performance of respectability. And so you see that woven throughout all of her club initiatives and all of her reform work as well. So we talked a little bit about mothers' meetings. How do mother meetings come about? So Margaret is going to go to the Tuskegee conference that her husband is hosting in 1892. At that conference, she's going to sit with the wives of the farmers who Booker T. Washington is helping to really make or professionalize what they're already doing with their hands. But what she's going to notice is that there's no platform for women, that women are not going to be acknowledged on the program. What women and children should be doing to aid their husbands is not going to be discussed. And so she's going to come up with this blueprint for what becomes known as mothers' meetings. And this is her talking about the first mothers' meeting. And she says, that first meeting I can never forget. The women came, and each one, as she entered, looked at me and seemed to say, where is it? And her response in that is, it's here. And it's with us. And so it was kind of this way of going into the community to say, if we are going to be saved, it's going to be through us. And no one is going to come to save us. And so she really is attempting through the mothers' meeting to mobilize the women. And without Twitter or Facebook, the word about the mothers' meeting is going to reach very, very far. And it's going to reach so far that when she's talking about this in 1907, it's going to have over 200 members in it. And so with that number of members, you also have a large number of children who are also a part of this club as well, or who are also around the club. And so one of the questions that comes up now is, what do we do with the children? And so while these things are happening, they're ultimately answering these questions. And so one of the things that happens with mothers' meetings and children is that they build a library. And it seems so simple, right? But not here because we're in the archives. But they build a library. And what the library does is it gives the young folk an opportunity and spaces to cultivate an imagination. It gives them the space, it gives them the ability to be children and to be youth and to do things outside of notions of labor or race or gender. And it allows them to cultivate healthy relationships. And so from there, you also have older children that's building reading groups. You're going to have a number of the children where they're teaching them to have a love for the land, So why is that important? Is that during this time period, there is also this sort of back and forth on what the land means. And for many of them, especially folks who were born within slavery, sometimes there was this negative connection to the land. And a negative connection to the land because many of them saw their family members being sold off in order to keep the land. Many of them shed blood because they attempted to escape the land. Many of them worked until they could not work any further to create profit for a land that they never saw the profits for. And so it's sort of easy when we think about it that way on why there was this sort of negative connection on, I'm not a slave anymore, so I don't have to work this land. Not only am I not a slave anymore, but is this land mine? And am I profiting from the seeds of the land? And so you see within the mothers' meeting, this push back towards creating this love for land. And there's also going to be this model that comes out of the mothers meeting and even within the Tuskegee Women's Club is from farm to plate, which we even think about today when we think about organic food and moving back towards that idea of really knowing what we're eating. That's what's happening during this time period as well. If we're going to eat it, we're going to grow it. And that's going to be really big because you have a number of stores that are going to overprice and overcharge for many things that they can just grow themselves. And so the mothers meeting is going to play very, very important parts in that. You also have the Tuskegee Women's Club. And within the Tuskegee Women's Club, you're going to have ultimately 10 different divisions. And today we're going to talk about, Today we're going to talk about, in particular, number 1 and number 10. We talked about number 9 a little, but what we see within the Tuskegee Women's Club is this idea that they are going to go into prison reform in ways that is unbelievable, in ways that we still see many of their efforts that are still being utilized and still benefiting the state of Alabama even today. And so one of the first ones is going to be the Russell Plantation. And so the Russell Plantation is about 8 miles from Tuskegee. There was this large plantation where some 30 families are living. Many other families live in the vicinity. It was here that some 10 years ago, Mrs. Washington started what she called a plantation settlement. And this was written by Emmett Scott, who, while Booker T. Washington was alive, was his secretary. Many would also say that he was his ghostwriter as well, but he was a very instrumental part of their family. From Emmett Scott, she also shared with him her family history. And so that's how you get a lot of her earlier histories that she's not going to talk about within her own writings. So she's going to start the Russell Plantation, and the Russell Plantation is really going to be this case study that Margaret uses. And so many former convicts are going to live on the Russell Plantation, and they're going to live in broken down homes, and they're going to plant, but not plant for themselves. They're going to not marry. Their children are going to run around in many ways that Margaret sees as backwards. And so she makes this reformation, she makes this plantation project one of her first projects within the Tuskegee Women's Club. And the first thing that she does is always this funny story, is that she gets the middle class women and they go to the plantation. And before they go to the plantation, though, she just starts knocking on doors. And she's knocking on doors because she wants someone to say that their house can be used as the host house for the next week's meeting. So the first house that she goes to, they don't answer. And so she goes to the second one and so on and so forth. And an older woman answers the door and she says, sure, you can use my house as the test house. And so they go back to that house the next week, these women in their fine clothing, and they invite the women within the community, and they have their brooms and their cleaning supplies. But if we can just think about sort of this audacity, right? And so the idea is that Margaret and these other club women are going to teach these women proper ways of cleaning their house. And so at first the women are looking at her, and I can just imagine, probably with a hand on a hip, like, let me see you sweep, let me see you clean, because I and my parents have worked in domestic entities for years and years and years. And so Margaret often retells this story. Someone sweeps, and I guess she's like, I'm not going to do it fully. So she half-heartedly sweeps the floor. And Margaret uses this as a teachable moment. So she takes the broom and she sweeps. Now, I don't know how many floors Margaret Washington has actually swept, but she sweeps the floor again. And so as she's sweeping the floor, the young lady, or the older lady, basically says, no, let me take the broom for you and I'll show you how to really do it. And so through this conversation, she's basically saying that yes, there were some tensions that were there when we first came into the community, but we basically showed that we each can teach each other something from this experience. And so she uses that basically to say that there are scientific ways of doing those things which we've already been doing. And so we can bring that to you. And so that's one of the things that's happening on the Russell Plantation, is this sort of building up of the women, but also building up of the families as well. And so you see the Russell Plantation as an extension of mothers' meetings. And mother meetings are still going to be a part of the Tuskegee Women's Club, but it's just going to be a different sector of that club. Another portion of the club, or that portion of the club, is going to take them into really what's happening with the prison system. And not just what's happening to the prison system, because if we know about the prison system just in this state, during this particular time period, it is grossing, I want to say, about 6 to 7% of the entire state's revenue. It's very, very big business. And so this idea of what's happening within prisons and what's happening to young Black folk are going to be very important questions. And so what's being done on the Russell Plantation ultimately is going to spread into other parts of Alabama. And so Mount Meigs is going to have the Mount Meigs Reformatory, which is still here. And Cornelia Bowen is going to be she's going to help to start it, her and Margaret. And the interesting thing about Cornelia Bowen is that she's going to be born on the plantation that ultimately becomes Tuskegee Institute at this time period, which was the Bowen Plantation, hence her name. Cornelia Bowen is also going to be one of the first graduates of Tuskegee Institute at this particular time period. So Tuskegee opens in 1881, and she's going to graduate from Tuskegee in 1885. So she's a part of the first graduating class. And she's going to start this reform work with Margaret, and initially it's going to serve as a school. And it's going to be a school for many of the young folk and older folk within the community. But then it's going to move into, what are we doing about the children? What are we doing about the young boys in particular who are imprisoned with older males? And so with that, they're going to come up with the Mount Meigs Colored Institute and Reformatory for juvenile delinquents. And so this is going to be an initiative that is happening in Mount Meigs, but we see its origins and beginnings happening in Tuskegee Institute, in Tuskegee, Alabama at that time period. And so after these women are working within this community, you also have Margaret reflecting back on this, and she says, they were a pride to themselves and a pride to those of us who have given our time. And so as this reflection is going on, she's also becoming smarter with her reform work to basically understand that if I do something for a few years, I have to be able to train this generation that's coming up behind me. And so you see her engaging in a number of reforms at this time, 1907 and onward, where she's sort of stepping back a little bit. And as she steps back a little, Tuskegee Women's Club is always going to be at the forefront, that she's going to really be a mainstay inside of. Black women in suffrage. So Black women in suffrage, there's often this thing that Margaret Washington and Booker T. Washington were anti-suffrage because Booker T. Washington basically made a comment one time that said, we have other things to think about than just the vote. And it was still true. However, it did not mean that they were not also engaged in the vote. And so there's going to be a suffrage component of the Tuskegee Women's Club, and that's going to be led by Adela Hunt Logan. But similar to the quote that I had in the beginning, one of the things that she really promoted was, yes, we're fighting for the vote, and yes, the vote is very, very important, but it's also equally important for us to use the tools that we have now to institute change. And so you see that throughout her work, even with the suffrage movement. And the other thing with the suffrage movement as well that we could talk about later or during the questions component is that oftentimes there was this idea that Black women were not a part of the suffrage movement in large numbers because they also weren't a part of these more predominantly white organizations. And so you have this separation of sex based on race that's happening around suffrage. And generally these Black women are also taking on a number of different issues as well, not just the ballot, but that didn't mean that they were not a part of that fight. And so this is coming towards the end, and it says, who was Washington as a club woman? And this just basically speaks to this idea that she's really giving to the middle class women that she's working with at that time period to say, it's not just about you and it's not just isolated. And if your child is the only one who you're seeing too, or seeing that as well, that's not going to lead the race into that next level of full citizenship. And so this is a mainstay throughout her entire club career, whether she's talking to women in Tuskegee and Alabama, throughout the nation, or internationally. She's always telling them or urging them that it's not just about you. And so, Margaret Murray Washington, a Tuskegee and national reformer. And just to add this at the end, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, he says, the end is in the beginning and lies far ahead. And so it's just this reminder that while we're at this end point, it always takes us back to that beginning point of who was Margaret Murray Washington when she was born, who was her mother, who was her father, and how do we get here today? Thank you.
For a few questions, if you'd like to answer.
I can hear you.
Shirley Cherry, Tuskegee Institute, class of 1966, okay?
Nice to meet you.
I had a question about Margaret Murray Washington's father. You said he died when she was 7.
Right.
You said that he worked on a railroad, and he was an Irishman. Do you have any information about what her relationship was with him up until that time? Was it just a slave master, or what was it?
Yeah, so that information is very sketchy. What we do find is that she takes on her father's name. And so that sort of alludes to the fact that it was a closer relationship because her name is going to be Margaret James Murray. And so she takes his name into her name. And so you can allude to the fact that there was a closer relationship, but there is no records that say that her father owned her mother. And I think the other interesting part about that is the relationship of Irishmen to whiteness at that particular time period. Some studies would say that it's not even interracial because of the low status of Irishmen in the South, particularly at that time. So I would doubt that he owned her, but he could have. But it's no records that actually show that. Thank you.
I'm interested in the end. How does it end for her? And what about Booker T. Washington in regards to his death and hers?
How it ends. So she ends as a reformer still. It ends quietly in her home. And Booker T. Washington, ask me the question again. I might be answering it wrong.
Was is how does it end with Booker T. Washington, but also with what is...
So in terms of legacy, so I'll answer it in that way. So Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, and she's going to live a decade after his death. So she's not going to die until 1925. And we just know historically that there's a lot that's happening between 1915 and 1925. There's also interesting components in terms of their relationship while he was alive. So, for instance, one thing I said in the beginning is that Margaret was very, very adamant about incorporating Black history into the study of, or into the curriculum. There was this one story where she has dolls, and because she wants to teach the children a love for self, she paints their faces black because she didn't have the resources to make new dolls. And so Booker T. Washington looked at it and he said, basically, that is hideous. Like, no, do not do that. And she goes and she pushes towards it anyway. And so one thing that you see with just her personality is that she is, when she's on to something, she's on it and she's going to stay with it. But what you see after his death is that she's able to not necessarily have to consult anyone on those decision-making skills. And so she's going to be involved with World War I. She's going to be involved with what happens in Haiti after World War I. She's going to be involved in, there's this idea that comes about the new Negro man, and she's going to be very instrumental in talking about the new Negro woman. And she's talking about it in the sense of, we're focusing on men, but what about the women? What are the women going to do when these men come back from war and they're now more experienced with international things? How are women going to really be able to cultivate their ideas if they're staying domestically? So you see a number of her initiatives evolve faster within that 10 years after his death, but she's still going to move forward in terms of reform work once he passes away in 1915. I hope I answered your question.
There's one right there.
What about Booker T. Washington's children? Did they follow in his footsteps in any way? Did they?
No. Sort of, but no. And even with Booker T. Washington, it's very difficult to follow in his footsteps. So even when you have presidents that come after him, there's this notion of a shadow. And so it's not far-fetched or crazy as to why Margaret is considered to be in that shadow of Booker T. Washington, because even if we say his name today in a different country like Liberia, people know who Booker T. Washington is. And so you really find most of the folks who are associated with Washington going in different ways, so music and things of that sort, but still working in terms of uplift, but just in different types of channels.
James, her mother's maiden name?
Yes.
Okay.
So, no, Murray. Well, her mother's maiden, she never has a maiden, or she never uses her maiden.
You mentioned the name James, and on that...
That's her father's first name, James Murray.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so James...
listed, and I wondered, was that her mother's maiden name?
Yeah, so James Murray is her father's name, and then her mother takes on the name Lucy Murray. Okay. But before that, you don't see a last name associated with her mother.
And does her mother survive to her daughter's
adulthood? Yes. Yes.
Okay. And what happened to her sister?
Oh, she's going to pass away. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's interesting to know that this prison problem just hadn't happened recently.
Oh, no. And the more interesting thing is that I think they've been reforming prison since they started. And so it's exactly.
Well, I know. I thought there was another question, but I know Dr. Harris will stay behind if you would like to talk to her. We also have out there for sale Alabama Women, Their Lives and Times, and she has an article in here on Margaret Murray Washington if you want to learn more, as well as about other Alabama women. And she did say she'd be willing to sign it for you if you go and get a copy. So just please join me in thanking Dr. Harris again for coming.
Thank you.
And joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out on this rainy day, and stay safe and dry.